July 14, 2023 began like any other summer morning in Colorado, the kind that made people believe nothing could go wrong if everything had been planned carefully enough. Kayla Brooks had spent years building that kind of confidence. At 25, she was known among her small circle in Denver as someone who never cut corners. Every trip she took into the backcountry followed the same pattern. Maps checked twice, weather reviewed, routes outlined, backup plans written down. Nothing was left to chance, at least not intentionally. Her apartment reflected that mindset. Notes were organized, gear was labeled, and each piece of equipment had a purpose that had been thought through long before it was ever used. Kayla was not chasing danger. She was chasing clarity. Photography had become her way of translating something intangible into something real, something she could hold on to. The mountains had always been part of that process. They were not a challenge to conquer, but a space where everything else felt quieter, more honest. The plan for this trip had been sitting on her calendar for weeks. For days. One loop, Bear Lake to Fern Lake and back. It was a route well known to experienced hikers, long enough to matter but predictable enough to manage if approached with discipline. Kayla had studied it carefully, marking out distances, elevation changes, and water sources. She knew exactly where she would be each night. She knew how much food she needed, how much margin she had if something went slightly off track. It was not an ambitious trip in the sense of risk. It was ambitious in the sense of precision. Before leaving Denver, she had sent everything to her mother, Linda Brooks. Not just a message, but a full outline. Dates, route, expected check-ins each evening. It was a habit she never skipped. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood how quickly small uncertainties could turn into something larger if no one knew where to start looking. Linda had read the message the same way she always did, carefully, making sure she understood the timeline. There was reassurance in that structure. Kayla had done this before. Kayla always followed through. At Bear Lake that morning, there was no disruption to that pattern. The parking area was busy in the usual way. People arriving, adjusting plans, moving toward their own routes. Kayla documented the start the same way she always did, capturing a final image before stepping into the trail system. It was not for social media. It was for her own record, a marker of intention before the outside world faded into distance. She sent the image immediately after it was taken. The message was brief, almost routine. Everything on schedule. Weather stable. Check in later. It was the last confirmation anyone would receive. From that point forward, the structure that defined her trips became invisible. The park swallowed signals quickly once the trail extended deeper into the terrain. That was expected. The lack of connection was part of the experience. It was accounted for. Nothing about that silence, at least at first, suggested anything unusual. Kayla had entered the route exactly as planned. She was equipped, prepared, and aware of where she was going. There were no deviations recorded at the start, no missteps in the preparation phase. If someone had examined the situation at that moment, everything would have pointed to a normal trip unfolding according to schedule. What made the situation different was not what happened at the beginning, but what failed to happen later. Every part of Kayla's system depended on continuity. Each check-in, each location, each expected movement created a chain that others could follow if needed. When that chain remained intact, it created a sense of control, even in a remote environment. On July 14th, that chain was still intact. The first link had been placed exactly where it should be. Nothing about that morning indicated how quickly that structure would begin to unravel. From the outside, there was no visible warning, no disruption in routine, no indication that the next 2 days would introduce a break in the pattern she had relied on for years. The park remained the same. The route remained the same. The plan remained the same. But something had already begun shifting, quietly, without leaving a mark that anyone could see at the time. And because everything at the start looked exactly right, no one had a reason to question it. The last confirmed contact from Kayla Brooks happened on July 14th, just before the trail absorbed her into a space where communication no longer followed ordinary rules. The message she sent that morning carried no urgency, no hesitation, no deviation from the plan she had outlined days earlier. It was consistent with everything her family expected. That consistency was what made what followed so difficult to interpret. For the rest of July 14th, the absence of additional updates did not raise concern. The route she had chosen was known for limited connectivity, and Kayla had built her routine around that limitation. Silence in this context was not unusual. It was part of the structure she had accounted for. Her mother, Linda Brooks, moved through that day with a quiet sense of assurance grounded in repetition. This had happened before. Kayla would reappear in the evening with a short message confirming her location and status. But the evening passed without that message. First, it was easy to explain. Delays happened. Timing shifted. Equipment sometimes failed to transmit immediately. None of those possibilities suggested danger on their own. Linda checked her phone more often than usual, not out of panic but out of habit. Each time the screen remained unchanged, the explanation adjusted slightly, becoming less certain but still reasonable. By the morning of July 15th, the silence had stretched longer than expected, but still not beyond what could be justified. Kayla had planned to move deeper along the route, and the terrain there was known to interfere with satellite signals. The assumption held: she was continuing as planned, simply unable to send updates. That assumption began to weaken by the evening of July 15th. Linda revisited the itinerary Kayla had shared. Every segment was clearly marked, each day structured around predictable progress. By that point in the timeline, there should have been at least one confirmation. The absence of it introduced a subtle shift in perception. What had been normal silence started to feel like a missing piece. Still, no immediate action was taken. In the United States, especially with experienced hikers, there is an understanding that delays alone do not justify emergency response. Overreaction can redirect resources unnecessarily. Linda knew that. She also knew Kayla's habits, her consistency, her discipline. The tension came from the space between those two realities. July 16th marked the third day of Kayla's trip. According to the plan, she would be near Fern Lake, following a route she had researched carefully. That day passed with no contact at all. By evening, the silence was no longer just an absence. It had become a pattern that did not fit the system Kayla had built. Linda began reaching out not to Kayla directly, but to the structures surrounding the park. Visitor information lines, ranger stations, any point of contact that might confirm whether Kayla had been seen or recorded along the route. The responses were limited. There were no immediate reports matching Kayla's description. That did not mean she was not there. It meant there was no confirmation either way. The lack of confirmation became its own kind of signal. By the morning of July 17th, the timeline Kayla had created had reached its final expected check-in window. She had committed to returning communication by that point. The fact that she had not done so could no longer be explained by routine delays alone. Linda reviewed the itinerary again, this time not for reassurance, but for clarity. Every detail that once felt like preparation now felt like a set of coordinates pointing to an unknown. Still, one more day passed before escalating further. That decision reflected both caution and hope. It was a balance between respecting Kayla's independence and acknowledging the growing inconsistency. In situations like this, there is often a moment when concern transitions into action. For Linda, that moment came on July 18th. The report was made that afternoon. From that point forward, the situation shifted out of the private space of family concern and into the formal structure of search and response. But at the time the report was filed, there was still no clear indication of what had gone wrong. The last confirmed point remained fixed on the morning of July 14th. Everything beyond that point existed without verification. The image Kayla had sent became more than a simple record. It became the final confirmed marker in a timeline that no longer progressed as expected. And because nothing in that message suggested a problem, it created a contradiction that no one could resolve yet. Everything had looked exactly as it should. And then, without explanation, it stopped. By July 16th, the structure that had defined Kayla Brooks's trip began to shift in a way that no one outside the mountains could see. According to the plan she had followed precisely up to that point, she would have reached the Fern Lake area on schedule. That part of the route had been calculated carefully in advance. Distances, elevation changes, expected pace, all of it had been accounted for. There was no reason to believe she had fallen behind or made an error in navigation. Everything suggested she had arrived where she intended to be. What changed was not her location, but her situation. Sometime during that third day, a decision point emerged that had not been part of the original plan. Kayla had identified a need to move toward a more reliable water source. That choice aligned with standard backcountry practice. Even experienced hikers adjusted their movements based on conditions, especially when long-term sustainability became a factor. The area around Fern Lake offered multiple potential routes downward, each carrying different levels of difficulty and risk. Kayla had studied those options before the trip, but in real time, conditions could alter how those routes behaved. At that stage, the difference between following the planned loop and adjusting direction was not dramatic on the surface. It was a matter of a few miles, a slight shift in elevation, a decision that would have seemed routine to someone with her background. But that shift changed the sequence of everything that followed. During her movement toward lower elevation, she encountered a section of terrain that did not behave as predictably as the map suggested. Loose rock, unstable footing, and uneven surfaces created a situation where forward progress became more complicated than expected. The incident itself was not catastrophic in the way people often imagine accidents in the backcountry. There was no dramatic fall, no immediate emergency signal. Instead, there was a gradual realization that continuing under the same assumptions was no longer possible. The effect was cumulative. Movement slowed, efficiency dropped, the margin for error narrowed. At that point, Kayla made a decision that would later define the entire outcome of the situation. Instead of attempting to return to the original campsite at Fern Lake, she committed to continuing downward. This was not a random choice. It reflected a fundamental principle of survival in remote terrain. When mobility is limited, the most reliable path forward is toward water and lower elevation, where the chances of detection increase. Before leaving the campsite area behind, she reorganized her equipment. This was consistent with everything known about her habits. She prioritized what mattered. The main pack contained essential supplies, water purification, food, navigation tools, emergency gear. Items that were not critical were left behind. The result was a clear shift in intent. This was no longer a temporary excursion away from camp. It was a transition to a new plan. The timeline continued to move forward, but without external confirmation, it became disconnected from observation. Each hour that passed placed her further from the last known point, both physically and in terms of predictability. The decisions she made were logical within her situation, but invisible to everyone else. The most significant consequence of that shift was not immediate. It came from the way it altered how her path could be interpreted later. Anyone analyzing the situation from the outside would rely on the original plan as a baseline. Every deviation from that plan would appear as an anomaly, something that required explanation. But for Kayla, in real time, those deviations were simply necessary adjustments. By the end of July 16th, the gap between expectation and reality had widened enough that it could no longer be bridged by assumptions alone. The original route, the one documented and shared, no longer reflected her actual position. The system that had been designed to keep her traceable had lost alignment with her decisions. And because no one yet knew that shift had happened, every subsequent effort to understand her situation would begin from a point that was already outdated. The chain of information that had started so clearly on July 14th was still intact on paper. But in practice, it had already broken. And no one had seen the moment it happened. By July 17th, the timeline that Kayla Brooks had carefully constructed reached its first real point of failure. According to everything she had shared before leaving Denver, that evening was supposed to mark a confirmed check-in. It was not a suggestion or a flexible estimate. It was a commitment built into the structure of her trip, something her family relied on to maintain a sense of connection despite the distance and the isolation of the route. That check-in never came. At first, the absence remained contained within the range of reasonable explanations. Delayed signals, temporary equipment issues, slight deviations in timing, Each possibility was familiar and had occurred before. Kayla had navigated remote areas enough times that small inconsistencies were expected. Nothing in her history suggested panic or loss of control. The system she followed was designed to absorb minor disruptions without escalating them into emergencies. But as the hours passed, the silence began to take on a different weight. By the morning of July 18th, the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. The delay was no longer a matter of timing. It was a break in a pattern that had never been broken before. Linda Brooks understood that difference immediately. It was not based on emotion alone. It was based on repetition, on years of consistent behavior that had never once failed to produce the expected result. Kayla did not miss check-ins. The decision to report her missing was not impulsive. It followed a deliberate process, one that reflected how missing person cases are typically handled in the United States, especially in national parks. There is always a balance between acting too early and waiting too long. In this case, the balance shifted decisively toward action. The report was filed with the appropriate authorities connected to Rocky Mountain National Park. Once the information entered the system, the nature of the situation changed immediately. What had been a private concern became an official case, subject to protocols, coordination, and structured response. Park rangers began by verifying the most basic details. Kayla's vehicle was located at the Bear Lake trailhead exactly where it should have been. Her name appeared in the trail registration records, confirming that she had entered the system as expected. There was no indication that she had exited. No record suggested she had abandoned the trip early or changed her plan in a way that brought her back to a known point. That confirmation narrowed the situation quickly. Kayla had entered the park. She had not left. By the morning of July 19th, the response escalated into a full-scale search operation. In the United States, particularly in areas like Rocky Mountain National Park, these operations follow established procedures. Teams are deployed in layers. Ground search units cover known routes. Specialized personnel analyze maps and movement patterns. K-9 units are brought in to track scent. Air support is prepared to expand coverage beyond what can be reached on foot. The initial focus of the search followed the logic of Kayla's original plan. The Bear Lake to Fern Lake route became the primary corridor of interest. Every decision made at this stage depended on one assumption: that Kayla had followed the itinerary she had shared. That assumption shaped everything. Search teams began moving through the route in segments, documenting any sign that could confirm or challenge the expected path. Equipment, footprints, campsite indicators, anything that could establish continuity between the trailhead and her intended destination. Each absence of evidence added pressure. Each unconfirmed segment extended the uncertainty. The structure of the search reflected a fundamental principle. Start with what is known. Expand outward only when necessary. By midday on July 19th, the operation had reached the area where Kayla was expected to have spent her second night. There was still no direct confirmation of her presence. That absence began to create a second layer of concern. It suggested that the timeline might not align as expected, even before reaching the third day. Still, the search continued forward. The teams maintained their focus on the planned route, moving methodically toward Fern Lake. Every step was guided by the same question: where should Kayla be if everything had gone according to plan? That question had not yet been replaced by a more difficult one, because at this stage, the system was still operating under the belief that the plan itself remained valid. What no one fully understood yet was that Kayla had already moved outside of that plan. Her decisions on July 16th had shifted her position away from the route everyone was searching. The map in her possession no longer matched the map in theirs. The search, precise and organized, was beginning from a point that no longer reflected reality. And because that shift had not been identified, every hour spent following the original plan increased the distance between where Kayla was expected to be and where she actually was. The operation was moving quickly, efficiently, and according to protocol. But it was moving in the wrong direction. By July 19th, the search operation had moved far enough along Kayla Brooks's planned route to reach the point where her presence should have been clearly confirmed. Instead, what the teams found introduced a different kind of certainty, one that immediately shifted how the situation was interpreted. The campsite near Fern Lake was located during the first full day of coordinated ground search. Everything about it suggested control. The setup was consistent with someone who had arrived on schedule and followed through with routine preparation. Nothing indicated panic, no signs of abrupt departure, no disruption that pointed to an immediate emergency at that location. The structure of the campsite reinforced what everyone had believed up to that point. Kayla had reached this area exactly as planned. But the absence within that structure mattered more than what was present. The main pack was gone. That detail narrowed the possibilities quickly. Kayla had not simply wandered away from camp without intention. She had left with purpose, carrying the equipment necessary to continue moving. At the same time, smaller items remained behind, non-essential gear, things that someone would reasonably discard when reducing weight or reorganizing under changing conditions. The pattern aligned with a deliberate decision, not a chaotic one. From a search and rescue perspective, that distinction was critical. It meant Kayla was likely mobile after leaving the campsite. It meant the timeline extended beyond Fern Lake. It also meant the direction of travel had to be determined with precision, because the margin for error in that kind of terrain was small. K-9 units were deployed to follow her scent from the campsite outward. The initial tracking produced a clear direction. The path did not lead back toward the main trail system. It moved away from it. That deviation confirmed what no one had fully accounted for until that moment. Kayla had altered her route. The teams followed the scent trail across a section of terrain that became increasingly unstable. The ground conditions changed in a way that affected both movement and tracking reliability. Loose rock formations and shifting surfaces introduced inconsistencies in the scent pattern. Still, the dogs maintained direction long enough to bring the search teams to a specific location that would redefine the entire operation. The jacket was found there. It was caught on a dry branch at a height that immediately suggested it had not been placed intentionally. The position, combined with the condition of the fabric, indicated that it had been left behind during movement, not removed and stored. The implication was direct. Kayla had passed through this exact point and continued beyond it. But what came after that was more important. The scent trail ended shortly beyond the location of the jacket. The loss of the trail did not happen gradually. It dropped off in a way that suggested interference rather than distance. Environmental factors became the primary explanation. Wind patterns in that area were known to shift unpredictably. The terrain beneath consisted of loose material that did not retain scent effectively. And nearby, a water source introduced another variable that could disrupt tracking entirely. Even with those explanations, the abruptness of the loss created a gap that could not be immediately filled. For the search teams, that gap carried weight. The last confirmed directional movement led to a point where physical evidence existed, the jacket, and then nothing. No continuation, no clear path forward. In missing person cases, that kind of break often signals a critical event. It suggests that something changed at that exact location, something significant enough to interrupt normal movement. The presence of the jacket amplified that interpretation. In isolation, the jacket could have been understood as a minor detail. Combined with the loss of the trail, it became something else. It introduced the possibility that Kayla had encountered a situation that prevented her from continuing in a predictable way. The nature of that situation remained unknown, but the effect was measurable. The search had reached a boundary it could not cross with the information available. Internally, the assessment began to shift. No official conclusion was made, but the probability models used in search operations adjusted quickly. Survival likelihoods are not determined by single pieces of evidence, but by patterns. At this point, the pattern was incomplete in a way that increased uncertainty while reducing optimism. The teams expanded the search radius from that location, attempting to identify any secondary signs, disturbed ground, displaced objects, anything that could indicate direction beyond the point where the scent was lost. The results remained consistent with what had already been found. A defined path leading to the jacket, followed by an absence of continuation. What complicated the situation further was the lack of contradiction. There was nothing to disprove the emerging interpretation. No evidence suggested a clear alternative. The search had produced a sequence that made sense within the limits of what was known, even if it did not provide an answer. Outside the operation, the information began to circulate in a more fragmented way. The detail about the jacket, once released, became a focal point. It was easy to understand, easy to visualize, and easy to misinterpret. For many, it became the defining element of the case, a symbol that seemed to point toward a conclusion that had not actually been reached. Inside the operation, that conclusion was not accepted. But the uncertainty surrounding it began to shape every decision moving forward. The search had found something real, and at the same time, it had lost the only clear path to finding anything more. By July 21st, the search for Kayla Brooks had entered a different phase, one that no longer relied on momentum, but on endurance. The early urgency had been replaced by repetition. Teams continued to move through the same sections of terrain, expanding outward from the last confirmed point, attempting to locate any fragment of information that could reestablish direction. But the structure of the search was beginning to reveal its limits. The original assumption still guided most decisions. Kayla's planned route remained the primary reference, even after evidence confirmed she had moved beyond it. The deviation had been acknowledged, but not fully understood. Without a clear continuation of her path, the search relied on probability rather than certainty. Grids were assigned. Zones were cleared. Each completed segment reduced the unknown area, but did not bring the teams closer to a definitive answer. By July 23rd, the operation had already covered the most accessible extensions of the known route. No additional personal items were found. No new scent trails could be confirmed. Air support conducted sweeps over broader sections, identifying areas that required ground verification. Each pass produced the same result. Nothing that could connect back to Kayla in a meaningful way. The absence of evidence began to accumulate as its own form of data. In missing person cases within U.S. national parks, there is a point where search operations must adapt not only to what is found, but to what is consistently not found. That point was approaching. The terrain surrounding the last known area was not uniform. It included sections that could conceal movement, disrupt tracking, and absorb any sign that might otherwise remain visible. The longer the search continued without results, the more those environmental factors became central to the analysis. By July 25th, internal briefings reflected a shift in language. The focus moved from immediate recovery to extended search probability. Survival windows were discussed in terms of statistical likelihood rather than individual capability. These discussions were not conclusions, but they influenced how resources were allocated. Time, personnel, and equipment were finite. Each decision to continue at full scale required justification based on evolving evidence. At the same time, no direct evidence suggested a final outcome. This created a tension within the operation. On one side, the lack of findings pointed toward a diminishing probability of survival. On the other, the absence of definitive proof prevented any formal conclusion. Kayla's case existed in that space between possibilities, where neither outcome could be confirmed. By July 28th, the decision was made to scale back the operation. This decision followed established protocols. Large-scale search efforts are designed to operate within defined timeframes, after which they transition into more targeted or limited forms. The change did not mean the search ended. It meant the intensity and coverage were reduced. Active teams were reassigned. Monitoring continued. Reports would still be evaluated. But the systematic, high-density search that had defined the previous days came to a close. For the Brooks family, that shift marked a moment that was difficult to interpret. The absence of closure remained. The process had moved forward, but the result had not changed. The system had done what it was designed to do: cover ground, analyze patterns, exhaust the most probable scenarios. And still, Kayla had not been located. Public awareness of the case had grown during this period. Local media had begun reporting on the search, emphasizing the scale of the operation and the details that were known. The jacket, in particular, had become a focal point. It was referenced repeatedly as the last physical evidence connected to Kayla. The narrative surrounding it became simplified, shaped by repetition rather than precision. That simplification created a secondary effect. As the story spread, the interpretation of the situation became more fixed. The absence of new information allowed assumptions to solidify. For many observers, the lack of progress was understood as a conclusion in itself. The nuance of the ongoing uncertainty was lost in the need for a definitive outcome. Within the official channels, that conclusion was never adopted. Kayla Brooks remained classified as missing. That classification carried weight. It meant the case was still open. It meant new information, if it appeared, would still be acted upon. It meant the possibility, however small it might be considered at that stage, had not been eliminated. But the operational reality had changed. The structured search had reached its limit without resolving the central question. The last confirmed evidence remained fixed at the same point. A campsite that showed deliberate departure, a jacket that marked a passage, and a trail that ended without explanation. Everything beyond that point remained unknown. And in that unknown, the case remained suspended, neither closed nor progressing, defined more by absence than by discovery. By the beginning of August 2023, the case of Kayla Brooks had settled into a quiet kind of uncertainty that was harder to confront than the urgency of the earlier days. The official search had slowed, the structured efforts had been scaled back, and what remained was a collection of data points that no longer connected in a way that could produce a clear answer. For most people, that would have marked the point where the situation stopped evolving. For Daniel Brooks, it marked the point where it finally became possible to look at everything without the pressure of immediate action. He did not approach it as a grieving father trying to force an outcome. He approached it the way he had approached every complex system in his professional life, as something that could be broken down, re-evaluated, and understood if the assumptions were stripped away. The first assumption he challenged was the most basic one, that the search had been focused in the right place. From the beginning, the operation had followed Kayla's planned route. That made sense at the time. It was the only reliable starting point. But by the time the campsite was found and the deviation confirmed, that original plan had already lost its relevance. The problem was not that the search teams had made a mistake. It was that they had been forced to operate without knowing when the plan stopped applying. Daniel went back to the moment that mattered most, the point where Kayla's path diverged from expectation. The campsite near Fern Lake, the missing main pack, the jacket found on the slope, the abrupt end of the scent trail. Those were not random pieces of information. They were part of a sequence that had been interpreted under pressure, with incomplete context. He removed the urgency from that sequence and looked at it again. The jacket had been treated as a possible indicator of a critical event. But when he examined the position and the conditions described in the reports, it suggested something else. It suggested movement through a narrow, unstable section where anything loosely attached could be caught and left behind. It did not necessarily indicate that Kayla had stopped there. It indicated that she had passed through. That distinction changed everything. If the jacket marked a passage point rather than an endpoint, then the loss of the scent trail immediately after it needed to be understood differently. The environmental factors cited by the search teams, wind, loose ground, proximity to water, were not secondary details. They were the most important variables. In those conditions, losing a scent did not mean the person had stopped moving. It meant the method of tracking had reached its limit. Daniel shifted his focus to what would have influenced Kayla's decisions in that moment. He knew her habits. He knew how she thought. More importantly, he understood the principles that guided movement in terrain like that. When mobility is reduced, when conditions become uncertain, the decision is not to move randomly. It is to simplify the problem. And the simplest objective in that situation is always the same. Find water, reduce elevation, increase the chance of being found. The search had concentrated on higher ground. That was the second assumption he challenged. Using topographic data and hydrological maps of the area, Daniel began tracing the most likely paths that would lead from the jacket's location downward toward consistent water sources. These were not official trails. They were natural channels, subtle shifts in elevation that guided movement even when no path was marked. He followed those lines the way someone with limited mobility would follow them, choosing the least resistance, the most direct descent, the most reliable direction. The pattern that emerged was clear. There were areas below the initial search grid that had not been prioritized. Not because they were inaccessible, but because they were not part of the expected route. The logic of the original search had kept the focus above a certain elevation. The logic of survival suggested the opposite. Daniel presented his findings with precision. He did not argue against the work that had already been done. He reframed it. He showed how the data could support a different interpretation without contradicting the original evidence. The jacket was still valid. The lost scent was still valid. The campsite still confirmed deliberate movement. But the direction of that movement needed to be reconsidered. First, the response was cautious. Search operations do not shift direction easily once resources have been allocated and time has passed. But Daniel's analysis did not rely on speculation. It relied on alignment between known facts and known behavior. Gradually, that alignment began to carry weight. A smaller, more targeted search was approved. It would not resemble the original operation. There would be no large-scale deployment, no broad coverage. Instead, it would focus on the specific areas Daniel had identified, lower elevation zones connected to the last confirmed point, areas shaped by water flow rather than map trails. For the first time since the search had been scaled back, the case had direction again. Not based on new evidence, but based on understanding the old evidence differently. And in that shift, something that had been overlooked from the beginning began to come into focus. Not as a certainty, but as a possibility strong enough to act on. The decision to return to the lower elevation zone did not carry the same urgency or scale as the original operation, but it carried something else that had been missing for days. Direction that aligned with behavior rather than assumption. The search teams that assembled in early August were smaller, more focused, and working with a different framework. They were no longer asking where Kayla Brooks should have been. They were asking where she would have gone if everything had changed. The area identified through Daniel Brooks's analysis was not entirely unknown. It had been part of the broader map from the beginning, but it had never been prioritized. It existed just outside the boundaries of the initial search grids, close enough to matter, far enough to be overlooked when time and resources were concentrated elsewhere. Now it became the center of attention. The shift in approach was immediate. Instead of expanding outward from the original trail system, the teams worked backward from the last confirmed evidence and projected forward along the most logical descent paths. The presence of water became the central variable. In survival situations, water is not just a resource. It is a guide. It shapes movement, limits options, and creates patterns that can be followed even when visibility and tracking fail. The first days of the renewed search did not produce immediate results. That, in itself, was expected. The terrain below the previous search area had the same characteristics that had disrupted the earlier operation. Unstable ground, unpredictable airflow, and conditions that absorbed evidence rather than preserving it. But this time, the absence of immediate findings did not create the same uncertainty. It fit within the revised understanding of how Kayla might have moved. Then, a change occurred. It did not begin with a visual confirmation. It began with a signal picked up by one of the K9 units, a faint but consistent trace that had not been detected before. The direction aligned with one of the projected paths Daniel had outlined. The team adjusted its position, narrowing its focus along that line. What had been a theoretical route began to take on weight. The trace led toward a narrow water channel, the kind of place that would not appear significant on a standard map but would matter to someone navigating under pressure. It was not a destination in the traditional sense. It was a point where multiple factors converged: water availability, reduced elevation, and a natural corridor that guided movement. The search team moved carefully, not because of visible obstacles, but because of the uncertainty that had defined the case from the beginning. Every step forward carried the possibility of confirmation or contradiction. Every indication had to be verified. The moment of discovery did not arrive as a sudden resolution. It emerged gradually, as separate pieces of information began to align in a way that had not happened before. Personal items were identified first. Not the main pack, but small elements that could be connected to Kayla with confidence. The presence of those items established continuity. It meant that the path they were following was not hypothetical. It was real. The search tightened further. Then, within that same corridor, Kayla Brooks was found. The condition she was in confirmed everything Daniel had believed. She had moved with intention. She had followed the most basic principles of survival, prioritizing water, conserving resources, and continuing in a direction that increased the likelihood of being located. The main pack, the one that had been missing from the campsite, had allowed her to maintain that process longer than the original projections had assumed possible. The distance between where she had been expected to be and where she was actually found was not extreme. It was measured in miles, not in vast, untraceable distances. But in the context of the search, those miles had represented a complete shift in understanding. They had been enough to separate expectation from reality, enough to turn a structured plan into a misaligned map. The jacket, once seen as a possible sign of something final, became something else entirely. It marked a moment of transition, not an ending. It represented the point where Kayla had moved through a difficult section and continued beyond it, leaving behind a detail that would later be misunderstood. The loss of the scent trail, once treated as a barrier, was redefined as a limitation of the method rather than a limitation of her movement. The environment had done exactly what it was known to do. It had disrupted the tools used to find her, not her ability to continue. As the situation came into focus, the sequence that had seemed fragmented began to connect. Every piece of evidence had been accurate. None of it had been misleading on its own. The difficulty had come from how those pieces were interpreted under pressure, how assumptions had filled the gaps where information was missing. Kayla's survival did not depend on extraordinary circumstances. It depended on decisions that were consistent with what she knew, what she had prepared for, and how she responded when the plan no longer applied. The same discipline that had defined the beginning of her trip had carried through to the point where everything became uncertain. When the search concluded, the case did not end with a sense of resolution in the traditional sense. It ended with a recognition of how close the margin had been, how easily the outcome could have aligned with the earlier assumptions instead of contradicting them. The difference came down to something small, almost invisible at first: the willingness to question what seemed obvious. In the end, the story of Kayla Brooks was not defined by the moment she disappeared, or even by the moment she was found. It was defined by the space in between, where uncertainty forced every assumption to be tested against reality. And in that space, the truth remained simple. Sometimes, what looks like the end of a path is only the point where we stop knowing how to follow it. But the path itself does not end there. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence here truly means more than you may realize. In a world that moves quickly and often overlooks the quiet moments, choosing to pause and reflect on a story like this is something meaningful in itself. This story is not just about a journey into the unknown, but about resilience, clarity in uncertainty, and the importance of not giving up when things no longer go according to plan. It reminds us that life does not always unfold the way we expect, and sometimes the answers we are searching for are not where we first believe them to be. What matters most is the ability to stay grounded, to think clearly, and to keep moving forward even when everything feels uncertain. If this story has left you with even a small thought, a reflection, or a feeling worth holding on to, then it has already served its purpose. To support our channel and help us continue sharing meaningful stories like this, all it takes is a simple action from you. Please consider liking this video, sharing your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing more stories that inspire, connect, and stay with you long after they end. Thank you once again for being here and for being part of this journey with us.